We needed to form the Premier League in order to bring about change, freshen things. But what we weren't expecting was to establish an enormous financial gulf between the two. In the first year of the Premier League, 92-93, the turnover of the Premier League Limited was £45 million. The turnover of the EFL was 34 million. So there was a gap of 11 million. The gap is now 3.3 billion. And yet we're still expecting clubs to rise and fall without facing catastrophe. At the end of the day, you don't need a parachute to fall off a step. You need a parachute to fall off a cliff. The Premier League clubs have chosen to increase their wages by 850 million. We've never asked for that amount of money. If we'd got our 25% split of revenues, which is what we've been looking for, it would have cost the Premier League an extra 300 million. To say they can't afford to help the pyramid.
Rick, thank you so much for joining us today. It's such a pleasure to have you in the studio.
Good to be here. Thank you.
I want to warm us up nicely because there's so many avenues that we can go into. So can we just have a little bit of an overview of your job right now, which is chair of the EFL, the English Football League?
The EFL matters enormously. Brings great authenticity. Vital part of the pyramid. And I much prefer to talk about one pyramid rather than two competitions, two leagues, because the very essence of English football is the ability to rise up the pyramid and indeed to fall down the pyramid. And recently we've been saying it should all be about sporting jeopardy without financial catastrophe. When Luton Town became the 51st club to join the Premier League, we all rejoiced. And the irony in that is, when I first got involved years ago, way back in late 1990, forming the Premier League, in 91-92, Luton Town were in the old First Division. So they took part in many of the vital votes that went into forming the Premier League. Got relegated at the end of 91-92, sadly. So didn't get the chance to play in the Premier League. They've dropped right down. They've been down into the National League. They've come back up. And that, as I said, that should be the essence of what our pyramid is all about, what makes English football unique. And keeping that in balance and making sure that everybody has that opportunity is really what we're striving for.
Why do we talk about two different leagues? The Premier League and its creation established in the early 90s, and the English Football League being a much bigger 72-team group. But what's the importance of the relationship between those two?
I think that's the biggest question of all, because clearly right up until 92, we had one league, the Football League, which was the oldest, the biggest league in the world. But I think it was a bit stagnant. English football had been through major challenges in the 1980s. It was an unwieldy voting structure. It was really difficult to get things done. And I think we needed to make the break. We needed to form the Premier League in order to bring about change, freshen things. And really what we were creating was a new governance structure for the 21st century, which I would say has worked pretty well. But what we weren't expecting, and nor was it part of the plan, was to establish an enormous financial gulf between the two. So, as I said, the ability to rise and fall, it's pretty remarkable when you think about it that in the 30-odd years that we've had the Premier League, 6 teams have been in it forever, but that means 45 haven't. More than 3 per place for the other 14 places. Man City haven't been in it forever, but the financial gap is now unbridgeable. So in the first year of the Premier League, 92-93, the turnover of the Premier League Limited was £45 million, which is a pretty small number in today's terms. It was quite a lot of money then. But the turnover of the EFL was 34 million. So there was a gap of 11 million. The gap is now 3.3 billion. And yet we're still expecting clubs to rise and fall without facing catastrophe. So the gap is the bit that we've got to address. Again, that first year, EFL's turnover was 75% of the Premier League's level. It's now 6%.
Is that driven by media from the Premier League's growth, or are there lots of factors that have created that chasm?
It's largely driven by media. Premier League has been extraordinarily successful in driving deals domestically and overseas, making more money overseas than domestically. The relationship between the Premier League and Sky has been extraordinarily successful for both parties. And if you go back to the 1980s, which in my terms isn't that long ago, I guess it is quite a long time ago, but that's when we first had live football on television. And it seems astonishing now, but the relationship between football and television was adversarial. So first live deal was 1982, 11 games a season, believe it or not. Second deal, 1985, we had the cartel in those days. It was ITV and BBC. They basically came into the Football League together and said, this is how much we'll pay you. The infamous Robert Maxwell got involved in 1985 and said, we can sort these guys out. They need football more than we need them. As a result of which, there was no football on television at all for the first 6 months of the season. Television walked away, and the Football League then went back cap in hand, did a deal at 3 million a year, half a dozen games on television. And then in 1988, well publicised, what can best be described as a fiasco. BBC, British Satellite Broadcasting came together in a pretty revolutionary deal. Didn't get the rights in the end. They went to ITV in the end through a fairly unseemly process. But again, then it was 18 live games a season. It was 11 million a year. And what had happened across those deals, the formula for sharing the money changed each time. So in 1982, all 92 clubs got the same amount. It was about 25 grand. That's how much the clubs were making from television. 1985, 50% went to the first division, 50% to the rest. 1988, 75% went to the first division, 25% to the rest. But every couple of years, there were threats of a breakaway. There were rows. The formula changed. And I said the relationship with television was adversarial. So the biggest factors for me in the success of the Premier League have been the fact that we had a formula for TV sharing which has stood the test of time, unchanged, unchallenged for 30 years plus. And the relationship with Sky has been brilliant for the Premier League, and it's been wonderful for Sky. The first chief executive of Sky, Sam Chasm, said the greatest corporate romance of all time. Growing together, a real partnership, using television, not just to generate revenue, but to promote, to showcase the game. I think it's been a real model. And again, the fact that we've had stability has given the Premier League the ability to grow. But sadly, the Football League has been rather left behind.
Is the chasm unfair, or is it actually just the very nature of economics, which is demand, supply, and price is an output of that?
No, it is unfair because the issue is there have been a lot of competition law cases of late, which is a really interesting topic in itself. Many different challenges being brought. And there was the European Super League case in the European Court a year ago now. It's amazing how quickly these things come around. But what that reinforced was that collective selling is basically anti-competitive. It is a restriction on competition and supply. and it's justified on the basis that there is a public good. It's deemed by competition authorities not necessarily to be in the best interests of consumers. They would much prefer a free-for-all, which is not good for football and never something I would advocate. But the way that you justify collective selling and the restrictions is on the basis that there is what the economists or the competition lawyers would call horizontal solidarity, which is the fair sharing within the Premier League, and vertical solidarity, which is the sharing downwards and the recognition of the whole pyramid. And the European Court was particularly strong on that in terms of that was looking at UEFA, it wasn't looking at domestic competitions. But again, it said you need to demonstrate horizontal solidarity and vertical solidarity. So the horizontal solidarity within the Premier League is the fair sharing of revenues within, because what you could do, of course, is to extend your logic and say, well, why don't the big clubs just keep all the money? They generate the revenues. Well, you haven't then got a fair competition. But then given the relevance and the importance of the pyramid, you have to look downwards as well. You can't just look across the league, you have to look downwards. And bearing in mind the turnover of clubs, here's another stat. This is one I came up with last Boxing Day, believe it or not, which shows what a sad life I have. But just in terms of, is it fair? Is it the right thing to do? If you look at the 14 clubs who were in the Premier League last year, who were the non-permanent members, on average, they had been in the Premier League for 13 years each, which means they hadn't been in the Premier League for 19 years each. They'd spent most of their time with the EFL. But if you then looked at the EFL clubs last season, and if you took the 14 of those who'd had the most experience in the Premier League over the years, so your Middlesbroughs, Blackburns, Leeds, Leicesters, Southamptons, Boltons, Wigans, Charltons, ironically, those 14 had also been in the Premier League for 13 years each. So we would say they had made just as great a contribution over the years to the growth and to the development of the Premier League. And yet the 14 in the Premier League for the time being last year got 1.8 billion from TV, 14 in the EFL, 90 million, 5%. So if you want a pyramid, and if you want the ability to rise and fall, then you have to have fairness. If you don't want a pyramid, if you want to have a Premier League with no promotion and relegation, guess what the value of that would be in a year or two with a sterile league? You know, that isn't going to work.
I think I just don't get, and the business of football is just so fundamentally broken, because I completely hear and understand you, but then you shift more of that media money towards, EFL, and the Premier League teams just become even more unprofitable than they already are, which is already propped up by a generation of billionaires, which is all now foreign. So how does this work?
Well, our purpose is making clubs sustainable. And I'm a great believer in purpose-driven organisations, purpose-led, something everybody can relate to. And we would define making clubs sustainable as reducing the dependence on owner funding, which is not the same thing as saying reducing ambition. We don't want to stifle ambition. We don't want to stifle the ability to grow, but it is the dependence that kills. And given the revenue that's flowing into the Premier League, why does it need to be spending more than it's earning when it's making more than twice as much as any other league in Europe? And I don't want to bore you with stats, but I'm going to. So one of the things that we said to Tracy Crouch in the fan-led review was, because people will say we're trying to dumb down the Premier League. Well, why would we want to do that? That would be the dumbest thing we could possibly do, because we need a successful Premier League. We want our biggest teams doing well in Europe. But we presented to Tracy back in, whenever it was, 2021, and we'd looked back over a decade. And what we said was, if you went back to 2018-19, the Premier League was paying 1.6 billion more in wages than the average of the other main European leagues. That's one heck of a gap. If you'd gone back 10 years previously, to 2008-9, they were paying 567 million more. Now, 2008-9 was the end of a vintage 5-year period for English clubs in Europe. We'd won the Champions League twice. We'd been losing finalists 4 times. 3 times out of the 5 years, we'd had 3 semi-finalists out of the 4. So that was a pretty successful era. And yet, as I said, we're paying 560 million more than the other major leagues. Within 10 years, that gap had grown to 1.6 billion. So the gap had grown by $1 billion. Why do we need to be growing that gap when we are way ahead in terms of attracting talent? And interestingly, because we have to update our presentations to parliamentarians all the time, if you looked at 22-23, 4 years on, the 4 years we've tried to talk about redistribution, when we've tried to talk about fairness, Premier League is now paying 2.2 billion more than the other major European leagues. So it's just spiraling out of control and just paying more and more and more for no apparent reason.
Is there not an apparent reason, which is if we don't pay them, they're going to go to Saudi, where they're going to get paid 500k a week, 600k a week, 700k a week. We have to keep being competitive with the money elsewhere.
No, they're not. They're not going to go. They will go to Saudi at the end of their careers. 5 years ago, everybody was saying they're all going to go to China. Mm-hmm. They didn't. Some did at the end of their careers. But, you know, the competition, the real competition is La Liga, it is Serie A, it's the Bundesliga. The 14 non-6 Premier League clubs last year paid more in wages than the whole of La Liga, including Real Madrid, Barcelona. That's just an arms race to stay in the Premier League. If we had a fairer system, if we didn't have a cliff edge at the bottom of the Premier League, if we didn't have financial catastrophe when teams drop out, then we'd have a fairer sporting system, and as I said, we'd have sporting jeopardy without financial catastrophe. So our position is there has to be a rethink. And in the 4 years we've been talking about redistribution, a better deal from the Premier League, the Premier League clubs have chosen to increase their wages by 850 million. We've never asked for that amount of money. At best, if we'd got our 25% split of revenues, which is what we've been looking for, it would have cost the Premier League an extra 300 million. But they've chosen to increase their wages by 850. So to say they can't afford to help the pyramid actually doesn't stack up.
So we talk about the solutions to this. We've spoken to a number of clubs and CEOs, and they've said if you know, and it's a problem in the Football League as well. If you give more money into the system right now, it doesn't help because it inflates the wages and it inflates the transfer prices. It doesn't allow you necessarily to spend on the infrastructure, the developments outside of it in ways that we would actually want to build better clubs. So if that's the case and more money into the game actually does, as you've just said, just to keep inflating transfer prices and wages and player associated costs, what is the solution that needs to come in to support that pyramid far better with the money that sits right at the top?
Well, the answer to that is you don't just need redistribution, you need better regulation as well. The two have to go hand in hand. And again, the point we made in the fan-led review was that making the whole game healthier means redistribution to make clubs solvent and better regulation to make sure they're not profligate. You have to do the two together. You can't have one without the other. So we're massively in favour of better regulation. We don't see that proper regulation is going to dumb the game down at all. We think the game needs it, and the game has basically demonstrated that it's not terribly good at it.
There's salary cap.
What is better regulation?
It's better governance. I think that if you look at what the independent regulator is going to tackle, it's going to address owners and directors tests. Now, owners and directors tests, as they stand, are not bad. The leagues do that reasonably well. But what the regulator will have is statutory powers, which we never have, so the ability to gather better information. Ultimately, the ability to prosecute if people don't provide full information. That's fairly potent. Other is a licensing system for clubs to make sure that they are run on sound financial principles, that they don't overstretch, that they don't overspend. At the end of the day, what an independent regulator is going to bring, they'll bring transparency and football is not very good at transparency. It likes to live in the dark. It'll bring independence, and independence is a good thing. It'll bring accountability, and it'll bring consistency across the leagues, because what we don't do well at the moment is to regulate properly across the Premier League and the Championship, for example. We have different disciplinary processes. We have different owners and directors tests. It should be the easiest thing in the world to have one common approach. We don't have it. And therefore, could football have done better? Could it have regulated better? Yes. Did it? No, it didn't. So we believe independent regulation alongside redistribution is what the game needs. And we have not done well either. We've had 30 years to sort out redistribution, and we haven't. So again, from our point of view, we think the regulator needs to have powers over redistribution.
So it would be a step process whereby you'd actually innovate on regulation that would then lead to redistribution.
So the regulator will have backstop powers over redistribution, but what the bill does is pull together redistribution and regulation, which is exactly the point we've been making, that you'd have to have the two hand in hand, one without the other. I think Tracy Crouch said once, one without the other is like trying to row a boat with one oar. You just end up going around in small circles. We, as you'll have gathered, are fans of independent regulation. We don't fear it. We think the game will thrive because of it, and we don't think investors will be frightened off. We don't think clubs will suffer. And given the size of the TV deals and the amount of money that's flowing in, we don't think there's a particular challenge. And you know, why at any level, especially at the Premier League level, should we have to have owners writing out checks to cover losses? It just seems ridiculous.
What is the current Premier League obligation to the EFL?
So we do have a solidarity agreement. We do get money from the Premier League, which we are grateful for. But if you look at the way it's constructed in the Championship, it actually exacerbates the problem, because it's defined as 11% of a parachute payment. So parachute payments in themselves are a major issue for us. But to say that on average, say 5 clubs are going to be receiving parachute payments, the other 19 who are trying to compete, their solidarity money from the Premier League is defined as 11% of a first-year parachute. So what we have is the parachute clubs this year will be getting 49 million from the Premier League. The average turnover of a Championship club is 24 million. So the other 19 clubs trying to compete with the parachute clubs, two consequences of that. As everybody can see, it's not statistics, it's just simple fact, it's just counting. Each of the last 7 years, 2 of the 3 promoted clubs from the Championship have been parachute clubs. Look at the Championship table. This weekend, the 3 top clubs are parachute clubs. Independent studies have shown that parachute clubs are 3 times more likely to be promoted than others. As I said, the facts over the last 7 years bear that out. But look at what else happens with the remaining clubs when they're trying to compete. Losses in the Championship, almost 400 million. Owner debt stands at 1.1 billion. Wages dipped a little bit last year, but regularly exceed 100% of turnover. That is not sustainability by any stretch of the imagination. So you have this crazy situation in the Championship of people overspending, dependent on the owners, in order to try vainly to compete with the parachute clubs. And again, what football's not very good at doing is stopping and saying why. It's not very good at purpose. It just sort of, things happen and nobody questions. So in 2010-11, parachute payments totaled 30 million. that was 7% of the combined turnover of the 24 championship clubs, which is not an insignificant proportion. 2020-21 parachute payments totaled 233 million, 39% of the turnover of the championship clubs. That is the cuckoo in the nest of the championship. That is a major problem that, again, needs to be tackled if we want a competitive system and we want fairness.
I thought it was to prevent catastrophe for the club in the lost revenue that they would have when they go down a league.
Well, what it does, and the purpose of it, is to help the clubs get back up. What it really means is you've got a Premier League in a sense of 24 or 25 clubs, 4 or 5 of whom have to spend an inconvenient year or two in the Championship. So if you tackle redistribution properly, you have what we call the cliff edge, the gap between the bottom of the Premier League and the top of the Championship. That's what needs to be tackled, because at the end of the day, you don't need a parachute to fall off a step. You need a parachute to fall off a cliff. If you didn't have a cliff, you wouldn't need a parachute. So if you tackle the root of the problem, and our proposal was twofold. One, it was to distribute revenues 75% to the Premier League, 25% to the EFL. We also said, by the way, that what we should be doing is combining our media revenues. We should be selling jointly rather than in competition with each other. Now, that may raise all sorts of competition law issues, which clearly have to be properly and rigorously addressed, but let's just go with that as an idea and a principle. We said we should split them 75% to the Premier League, 25% to the EFL, which coincidentally is what it was back in 1988 before we formed the Premier League, so it's not without precedent. That isn't the reason we came up with it. The reason we came up with it is because it actually works. We also said that we should have merit rakes in the Premier League and the Championship of 2-1. What's a merit rake? It's the difference between, or it's the ratio between the top club and the bottom club. If you did that, you would then halve the cliff edge. So instead of having a gap between the bottom of the Premier League and the top of the Championship of 100 million in TV distributions, it'd be 50 million. And if you halve the gap, you wouldn't need a parachute.
And in theory, if we're doing this, you're not looking to clip the success of the Premier League, right? You could distribute that money. And what it really would do is it would bring in a natural control, meaning they can't go and spend £500,000 a week.
The best way of reducing the spend is to control the supply of money. Salary caps, hard salary caps, we're not exploring those. Again, there's a whole bunch of legal issues that are associated with those. So that is not on the table at the moment. But the best way of curtailing spend is to reduce the money supply. If you give people money, they tend to spend it. And, our thesis, and nobody's actually proved it to be wrong, by the way, is that if you have fairer redistribution, you don't have a different group of players in the Premier League. They just earn a bit less. They're not going to miss out compared with the European rivals when, as I said, the Premier League is outspending its European rivals by 2.2 billion, and we're not doing as well in Europe as we were years ago. So Bundesliga clubs, Italian clubs have been to an extent in the doldrums, perhaps coming back up, but other European clubs seem to survive. As I said, it's just a need to have some checks and balances, curb some of the excesses, and recognise, as I said, a degree of fairness. That is if we value the pyramid that is uniquely English.
You were the first chief executive of the Premier League. You were in there in the early days. You're seeing this, I guess, the early stages of a division that was starting to grow right from the off. Was there a moment when you were in charge where you thought, this is actually going somewhere that could cause us a problem down the line? Or is this something that's happened more recently, last 10 to 15 years?
Interestingly, back in 95, so the first year of the Premier League, first 5-year Premier League TV deal was worth 214 million. That in itself was a 400% increase on the old Football League deal. We back in 95, that was a year or two out from renewing the deal, had a pretty good inkling that the next deal was going to be even better because, again, if you look at the history of what television looked like, early 1980s, we had the cartel. There was no competition. Two is a cartel in broadcasting terms, so BBC and ITV, terrestrial broadcasters had the cartel. ITV got an exclusive deal in 1988 and were paying us at 11 million a year, which was decent money in those days, but that was pretty much the level of what an advertising funded broadcaster, terrestrial broadcaster, could afford to pay. What happened in 92 when we had Sky, analog satellite broadcaster, introducing pay TV for the first time. And I was definitely public enemy number one for quite a long period for the temerity of taking football off terrestrial television, and it was going to be a disaster. And bearing in mind, when we did the deal with Sky, they were losing 250 million a year, which takes some doing. Very, very few subscribers. It was quite a bold move, but I said it turned out to be quite a good one. But if we go forward to 96, 97, on the horizon then, we had the shift from analog satellite to digital satellite. Even on analog satellite, it was a limited number of channels. It was the digital transformation that brought almost unlimited capacity. So it was clear to us. We thought back in 95 that our deal of 40 million a year might go up to 100 million. Alan Sugar famously used the word prune juice in terms of the money just pours straight through and out to the players. So in 95, we did actually think amongst the Premier League clubs that there might be a looming problem. And believe it or not, in a 20-minute debate, we had a unanimous approval to go to the Football League and say, we think the gap is going to widen. We made them an offer to basically take on the selling of their TV rights, to work collectively, and to offer them a minimum of 20% of the combined pot. 71 out of the 72 clubs voted in favour, in principle. The following week, the board of the Football League did a deal with Sky, 5-year deal with Sky, so they rejected the Premier League offer. And the deal with Sky was 25 million a year, which, bearing in mind, Premier League deal was 40 million a year, looked like quite a good deal. Until, in 96, we announced a new deal at 176 million a year. Clubs fired the board, the Football League, because they realised our deal would have been a better one. But in 95, we did actually come close to coming back together and having a fair redistribution formula. It didn't happen, sadly. Football League turned it down. And I guess, I don't know why, but it's never actually come back on the table again. But yes, there was a moment when we thought that would have made more sense for the game, and we did realise the Premier League was going to move further apart. But never, I think, did we think that, again, the Premier League's turnover has gone from 45 million to 3.5 billion. It's gone up nearly 80-fold. The EFL's turnover has gone from 34 million to 200 million. It's gone up 6 times. So it's just, it's just diverged massively in absolute and percentage terms.
So can I ask, you were chief executive of Liverpool, which I think is a really important context to this conversation and how I can then ask this question, because the challenge to a lot of this is going to be the appetite of the big teams, the big clubs, to look outside of their own self-interest and recognise the value that they have to share with the broader Football League. If you have your chief executive of Liverpool hat on and you're being brought into this conversation now, rather than looking after the collective, you're charged with Liverpool's interests. Do you have the same mindset? Do you understand this? Do you support it in the same way?
Wow, I don't know, is the honest answer to that. The trite answer is, well, of course I'd be voting in favour, but the reality is when you're running a club, you have got fiduciary duties, you've got pressures, you're immersed in trying to succeed. And, it was really interesting reading one of the many competition law decisions recently, which was the Manchester City against the Premier League one. Well, I found it interesting. Most people wouldn't find it remotely interesting. But it was only in the preamble where the panel said the Premier League is a company which exists to further the interests of its shareholders. And, well, of course, it's a statement of the obvious, but that's right. In a sense, that's the challenge of the two separate organisations, two limited companies. They're not there to further the interests of the game as a whole. So without that independent oversight and pressure, why would the game make the right rational decisions? Because it doesn't. And you make decisions conditioned upon where you happen to be in the pyramid at a point in time. I mean, football is the ultimate self-interest. Our sport differs from American sport. American sport, no promotion and relegation, revenue shares, hard caps, first pick of the players next time around. It is the joint enterprise model. If you're an NFL owner, in effect, you're a partner in the NFL. Everybody shares in the success. Your values all rise together. In football, we're all trying to kill each other. Let's be honest.
But could you have that same structure with relegation?
I think there are two complexities. One is the structure within England. The other added dimension, of course, is the international nature of the game, because you've got the two dimensions. If you're Liverpool, you're not just competing with Manchester United, you're competing with Juventus, Real Madrid, Barcelona. UEFA has obviously tried hard to introduce elements of financial control through its financial fair play, which did help to stem losses, which were pretty much spiraling out of control. But the dynamics are so different. So the idea that we'd change that mindset and have everybody recognizing that if we all succeed together, we all generate more value. Nice idea, but don't see it anytime soon.
When you were chief executive of Liverpool, were these conversations ongoing? You looked at the success, you could see where the league was going, you could see the numbers were going up, as you said. Performance of English teams in Europe was incredibly successful. Liverpool won the Champions League when you were there. Were these types of conversations ongoing then? Or is this, again, a product of the last maybe 10 or so years?
No, they weren't going on, really. I think it is more recent. I think the problems have become more acute. I think what's really interesting is there are rich seams of data available. They're so easy to find. There's the annual Deloitte report, which I find invaluable. All of this information is there. This has been staring people in the face, but nobody has actually said, wow, we need to do something about this. I think maybe there's been a degree of, in years gone by, maybe a degree of subservience from the Football League in terms of our lot is just to get whatever crumbs the Premier League throws us. Maybe COVID sharpened minds, because clearly we had a crisis to face. Undoubtedly, the fan-led review has given us the platform and the opportunity to raise this. Well, I guess from my perspective too, I thought when I came in and took over the role, it wasn't to preserve the status quo or just to keep the EFL in the position it was in. It was, can we bring about some change? Can we improve the game for the better?
Change is always tough. If change isn't achieved, what happens then? How does the game look if change doesn't happen?
The paradox is the game is in pretty rude health in many, many ways, by many metrics. So EFL, We got a good new TV deal, very good new TV deal, which we're delighted with. We're delighted with the commitment that Sky has shown, not just in terms of the money, but in terms of showcasing the EFL, more games, different way of showcasing games, streaming rather than simply broadcasting. So we kind of feel we're a little bit more maybe at the cutting edge and working with Sky on new ideas and innovating. I think the other thing that we haven't touched on but is extraordinarily important is we focus on competition, we focus on what happens on the pitch. Our clubs are genuinely the beating heart of their communities. If you look at what happened with Bury, when Bury went out of business, that is an enormous shock. That's a shock that's felt nationally, not just locally. And it was the demise of Bury that ironically led the Conservative government in its manifesto back in 2019 to commit to a fan-led review. Didn't actually do it until we had the Super League crisis. And then, in terms of what can the government do, we had a manifesto commitment. We said we'd do a fan-led review. Well, now seems like the time to do it. But as I said, I think with our clubs, the work they do within their communities, the contribution they make to towns and cities, over £1 billion worth of social value created. That's a huge number. And if I were the government, and I'm delighted that I'm not, but if they wanted to achieve change in communities, if they wanted really to achieve levelling up, we have 72 social entrepreneurs who get stuff done across mental health, physical health, employability, education, well-being, loneliness.
So should it be government subsidised? We spend
No, that's not the point at all. It doesn't need government subsidy. It's just government should be knocking on our door to say, if we want to achieve social change. There was a great stat in terms of the importance of football, because the Euros coincided with the build-up to the general election. And these won't be the right numbers, but it doesn't matter. But, England against Spain is attracting 24 million viewers. Rishi Sunak against Keir Starmer gets about 1 million. Football really, really matters. And it's why it's important that we bring about change and that we create a better platform for the future.
I don't want to just focus on, in this question, at Wrexham, but does the mediafication of clubs now in the Football League, it's not just the Premier League clubs being bought that are driving all the value. Does that present an opportunity to the 72 clubs to attract good money, to attract different eyeballs, to reach out to new markets, and ultimately, therefore, drive more revenues that will help them on that journey to sustainability as well as from payments?
Yeah. And we have to be seen to be helping ourselves. But, make no mistake, and absolutely rightly and understandably, where do Wrexham want to be? They want to be in the Premier League. That's where everybody wants to be, and that's entirely appropriate and right. And again, that's all about the pyramid and why the pyramid should matter. It's not only Wrexham. If you look at Ipswich, for example, when new investors came in, when Ipswich were in League One, club with a proud heritage, great track record of success across 70s, 80s, 90s, and took them straight back up into the Premier League, which is a brilliant story. Not every club can do that, because to get there, you still have to compete with the parachute clubs, as I've said. So it's not easy getting there. But, Wrexham don't want to be succeeding in the EFL. They want to be rising. And Wrexham are brilliant for the EFL, particularly in the States. They have definitely helped to raise the profile. We have a great TV deal now in the States. We're getting great coverage. But again, let's not forget the chasm between us and the Premier League is the issue. The Premier League issued a stat recently as part of its parliamentary lobbying to say there isn't a problem because the EFL is the 6th richest league in Europe. You're thinking, well, hang on, that's just a random fact. How is that conceivably relevant? If we wanted to attach ourselves to the Portuguese First Division, maybe it would be relevant. But the relevance is the size of the gap within England, not how we stand compared with other European leagues. And, you know, brilliant for us to increase our TV deal by 50%, but it doesn't move the dial in terms of the gap with the Premier League.
I anticipate you may say this is partly now because of parachute payments and what clubs in the Championship still get from the Premier League. But is there an issue in your eyes from governing 72 clubs in one set of regulations when you do have, let's say, a Leeds and looking after their interests, and you also have a Morecambe looking after their interests?
Historically, there was definitely an issue. I mean, if we go back 30 years and we look at the 92, the whole thing was unwieldy. There was a massive frustration because you couldn't innovate. And what I found really interesting was going around talking to the First Division clubs when we were thinking of forming the new league, when we were talking about a breakaway. Most of them couldn't even articulate what the voting structure of the Football League was. And it was very strange. The First Division clubs had 1.5 votes each. The Second Division clubs had a vote each. The Third and Fourth Division clubs had 8 votes between them. And if you do the arithmetic on that, it pretty much means you've got a deadlock. If you look at the structure of the management committee, you had 4 members from the First Division, 3 from the Second, 1 from the Third and Fourth. Again, deadlocked, and broadly inward-looking. So I remember the sort of decisions that were being taken at the time, or not taken. First Division clubs came up with a proposal to increase the half-time interval so that they could sell more refreshments. They were outvoted by the smaller clubs who didn't need it. You just had a succession of frustrations. I did a consultancy project for the Football League back in the mid-80s, and we're just looking at the efficiency, how it functioned, how the management committee worked, how the executive functioned, and you had this sort of plethora of subcommittees covering everything under the sun. And flicking through the handbook, actually eventually found one that looked really interesting, which was the Future of the Game subcommittee. So what does that do? We haven't had time for that one to meet. Everybody's too busy. I think, well, that about sums it up. And as I said earlier, what we did when creating the Premier League, we came up with a really, really simple constitution. We wrote the constitution in 2 hours on one piece of paper, the founder members agreement. 1 club, 1 vote. Really, really simple. 2/3 majority for all decisions. Independent board of directors. That was an absolute first in football. No clubs involved on the board of the Premier League. So you had that independence. You had that more trust in terms of the clubs recognising that, you know, the board wasn't beholden to any individual club. Each club with an equal vote. Very, very simple, transparent, very, very straightforward. And it worked. It enabled the Premier League to make decisions quickly, to get on with things, to innovate, to drive the success. And again, that partnership with Sky that we stuck to, and we made it a partnership. It wasn't adversarial. It wasn't give us the money and then we'll forget all about the relationship. You look at the way they innovated coverage, the changes they introduced, the 18-camera coverage, the super slow-mos, little things like the numbers on the back of the shirts, the identification of players, making the players' personalities. This is all about driving popularity, making them stars, and a lot of the stuff that didn't even really get noticed from those early days. So the use of close-up so you can actually see the players, identify the players, understand who the players are. Really, really, brilliantly exciting times, those early 90s, but absolutely creating that platform of, as I said, innovation, change. And I think if we hadn't broken away, I haven't a clue what the question was, by the way, but it all sounds quite interesting. It's interesting to me anyway. But
no, the question was the regulation of now, having to govern 72 clubs.
Yeah. Well, so what I was getting to, that the whole 92 thing wasn't working because it was stifled. But actually, one of the things I've been really, really pleased with, and I turned down the EFL job 3 times. Because I kind of remembered what it used to look like.
Why take it when you did?
Because I thought I could help make a difference. And
do you still think you can?
Yeah. If I didn't, I wouldn't be doing it. And actually, the more I thought about it, the more I thought, obviously, a lot of my time's been spent in the Premier League, with the Premier League. Premier League matters, but then so does the EFL. And there is a real authenticity to many of our clubs. Owners, by and large, are fantastic and completely committed. All of the community work, it really is important, and it really is important that our pyramid thrives. We don't want to be losing clubs. We want our clubs to be growing, to be confident, to be well run. And you're right, we do have a structure of very big clubs and very small clubs. And actually the paradox is most of our clubs don't want to be in the EFL. They'd really like to be in the Premier League. So, they're not... I try not to describe them as EFL members. I try and talk much more about the pyramid. But the thing that has, I think, encouraged me most is the degree of togetherness we've had with the 72. I think maybe that came to the fore through COVID when everybody rallied together. But there's never been a sense within the championship of we're going to ditch the rest.
And you supported those clubs financially, didn't you, through?
Yeah. Yes, we did. And I think getting through with the 72 intact was challenging at times. I mean, COVID, not just for football, but for everybody, you go and reach for the manual and realise, well, there isn't one. We've never been through this before. So you're making big and tough decisions every single day. So that was quite an exciting time. But that degree of togetherness and clubs really showing their strengths in terms of what they were doing within their communities, becoming vaccination centres, becoming testing centres, providing hot meals, using their kitchens, players, managers phoning fans, combating loneliness. And obviously government was really, really keen for us to start playing again as soon as possible, even when we couldn't have fans back in stadia. The recognition that bringing back football, giving people a focus, giving them something to hope about, even if it was only watching them on television. I remember going to a game at Crewe against Portsmouth in League One. COVID was kind of characterised by eerie silences in stadia. It was a strange time, but there was sort of a beating of the drum and some chanting, and you're thinking, what is going on? Is it our imagination? But a group of Portsmouth fans had actually travelled up on the train to stand outside the stadium, and you think, I mean, that is pretty astonishing, but almost just to participate through proximity. I mean, if anything shows how much football matters and the relevance of keeping the clubs alive and getting it going again.
Do you think we will see more buries? You said about the struggle of getting 72 teams through it. Do you think we will see more buries happen?
We're hoping not. But the problem with owner funding is it is fantastic until the day it isn't. And you look at clubs like Derby, Bolton, Blackburn, Wigan, Reading, where owners have shown a tremendous commitment, and then either they become old, well, we're all going to become old, they become ill, Sadly, they die, or they wake up one morning and think, I can't afford to do this anymore. And suddenly you have a crisis. Ironically, I think if we have a crisis, and we hope we won't, more likely to be at a Championship club than a League Two club or a League One club. We wouldn't have another Bury because we've tightened our regulations, in particular in relation to the owners and directors test. There was a fairly major loophole back then where incoming directors didn't have to show evidence of funds until 2 weeks after they'd bought the club.
Huh.
That's a fairly basic failure. Yeah, a little bit late.
Only post-driving do you have to show your test.
So we closed that loophole, and obviously that's made a difference. But equally, there wasn't a queue of owners to buy Bury back then. So touch wood, these days we have a lot of interest in acquiring clubs. We have a lot of new owners. But again, it shouldn't be that dependence on the owner writing checks.
Do you worry about the soaring asset price of these clubs? Some of the prices of these clubs is astronomical.
Yeah, that's more an issue at Premier League level than our level. Ours tend to be a little bit cheaper. But even so, people looking below the Premier League, thinking they can pick up a Championship club and all they have to do is to spend a few quid and they'll be in the Premier League, and it's a bit more difficult than that. The irony if you look at the Premier League, you've got a major divergence in values, and if you look at the MLS, for example, in the States, where the quality of the football isn't on a par, the level of interest in the game isn't quite on a par. I'm a big fan of American football in America and the MLS, by the way, but it's got a long way to go. But what's really interesting is the value of the MLS franchises, which is now significantly higher than many of the clubs in the lower reaches of the Premier League. We would say that's partly because of the financial uncertainty and the gaps. And if we actually had, back to our mantra of the fairer revenue distribution, greater certainty, we think the enterprise value of the Premier League clubs would actually rise.
Do you
think
MLS enterprise value sustains in a post-Messi world?
Well, who's to say it isn't? Who's to say it isn't? You can look at those values and think, what is it based upon? Not based on current revenues.
I think probably future distribution, attention, mind share, which then all correlates to future revenues. And that is driven by Messi, the distribution deals that he has with Apple, and bluntly what he brings. If he was not there, I do not think you would see the asset price increase.
I'm not sure. I don't think it's one person. I really don't think it's one person, because this has been a trend. And if you look at the basic demographics of the States,
phenomenally ripe for football with the Latino.
It's absolutely right. Well, I know there are more Hispanics in the States than there are in Spain. So, the comparison shouldn't be, can we build football to compete with the NFL? It's, can we build football to compete with a European country? And I think they can. No reason why they, absolutely no reason why they can't. I think the next World Cup that will help enormously. That will add to the profile. So, why can't the game grow and succeed in the state? It will. Frankly, I'm sure it will.
You look over there, and you've said it many times. How many friends do you have out there who have their European League teams, their Premier League teams, and actually don't really care about their domestic team, their MLS team?
Everyone.
The lack of association can come from the fact that you can lift a franchise in the US and plonk it in a different city, and suddenly your association is gone. If anything, it's the antithesis of the values that we attribute our sport to, which is absolutely integral to its communities, reliant on its history. And so, while we've got issues, it's almost that it's the horrible dichotomy. Can you have that unending value, that unending opportunity, but have an open league? Because the closed league is what creates a lot of the value. That asset's always going to be there. It's always going to be participating in that top league. But we can't have that because we don't want to have a closed system.
And nor should we, because you have to have jeopardy. you can't all be winners. That's the essence of sport. For every winner, there has to be a loser. But the important thing is when you lose, you don't go out of business. So you can fight again another day. So it is about the checks and balances and that degree of fairness. So you've got a system where you celebrate success. You don't celebrate defeat, but you know that one day you're going to bounce back again.
Should we do a quick fire?
Let's do it. You start.
Yeah. Got a few, so shorter answers, but it's just interesting. So to start with, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently when setting up the Premier League?
Hindsight is not in my dictionary because I think it's a nonsensical word because nobody has hindsight. Given the circumstances we had at the time, I'm not sure we'd have done much different because it has been successful. We needed that absolute sort of clarity and simplicity of focus of what we were trying to do. Did we know that there was going to be such a growth in revenues and a divergence? No, frankly, we really didn't. I said in 95 we did try to offer the Football League then the opportunity to come with us and attach itself. With hindsight, they should have done. And maybe I wish they had done. But I don't actually spend any of my time looking back and thinking, what would I have done? Because there's too much to think about in terms of what we're going to do tomorrow.
Looking forward, Sam, what's the biggest untapped revenue stream in football?
I don't know. Clubs are becoming more sophisticated. I think what's really interesting is whether football will develop a more direct relationship with consumers in terms of the broadcast consumer. At the moment, they are customers of the broadcaster. Will we get to a stage with streaming where we know who's watching at any moment in time, where merchandise can be sold instantly, click on the red button and
buy a shirt
for the player who's just scored? How big will that actually be? I don't know.
Is there a club or a CEO currently that you admire the most for how they're running their organisation?
I admire lots of them. We've got lots in the EFL. There are lots in the Premier League. I mean, this is not, I'm not anti-Premier League clubs. As I said, I tend to talk pyramid rather than EFL versus Premier League because of the movement up and down. Many of the clubs in the Premier League will be back with us. Many of the clubs with us will be up in the Premier League. There's lots of competent people.
Rick, listen, thank you so much for joining us today. I so appreciate the time. It's been fantastic to have you here.
Hasn't he? Thank you.
Thank you.